Okay, Morris. So to begin, I know you've been preparing for the interview, so I wanted to give you a second to get on record sort of your legacy at the museum. If you want to just walk us through how you started here and some key moments as a big narrative, and then we'll get into specific questions after.
Okay, well, the big narrative actually began when I was asked by the City Council to be the chairman of a committee that they were establishing to develop a 60th anniversary project for the city of Red Deer. This was, the 60th anniversary was coming up in 1973, and this would be about 1970 that committee was struck. So we put together a community committee to discuss what might be the singular effort for the city to recognize its 60th anniversary. The city was declared a city in 1913, so we were looking at a commemorative project, and it could have been a book, it could have been a play, it could have been anything. And the committee worked on various topics, and then at one meeting, Mrs. Jean Daw came out with the idea that Red Deer did not have a museum, and most other communities did have a museum. Remember, 1967 was the 100th anniversary of the founding of our country, and so many communities developed history books and museums and other sort of historical milestones for their community, but Red Deer did not have a museum. There had been a couple of attempts to start a museum earlier on, but they had sort of fizzled and failed. And one of them particularly had failed, and there was some question about the propriety of the whole thing. So there was a little skepticism there. However, the committee took its recommendation to City Council, and City Council adopted the idea that we would have a museum built as a 60th anniversary project. And the reason I'm talking about that at the beginning, which seems rather mundane, is that put the imprimatur of the city onto the museum. And the city has maintained its commitment to the museum all these years later. And in fact, in the days when I was the director of the museum for the first 20 years of its existence in this building, the Red Deer City Council, Red Deer community funded the museum at a higher level than any other community museum in Canada. And that was simply because they had taken it on as their project. It was not a project that had grown up in the community and then was left for the council to fund. So, the way the times evolved was that there was a museum society established as a nonprofit group to spearhead the development of the museum, because the city realized they were not going to do that. And so the Red Deer and District Museum Society was formed and very quickly began to build a nest and start to work. And at that time, the building next door to what is now the museum building, the recreation center, was established, and it had an unused basement area that had a ramp, which was a necessity for a museum, a concrete building, and so the recreation department turned over the use of that space to the Museum Society to develop into a museum. And it was a large space. It was about 40 by 70 feet and completely unobstructed. So very quickly, artifacts began to pour in, and volunteers were marshaled to manage the affairs, and the museum was begun. And it was opened officially by one of Red Deer's native sons, then Governor General Roland Michener. And he came on one of his visits, and he opened the museum officially in the summer of about 1972 or 3.
still thinking about the beginning of the museum, I'd love to know what your personal vision for the museum was, and also the community. What was the big motivation to put in all the effort to set up this institution?
I think the key thing of any museum, and ours certainly for Red Deer, was to tell the story of the community. What was unique about, or what was special about the development of our community in Red Deer here that would be of interest and instructive and helpful to people understanding our community? People who live here, people who come here, and people who visit here. And so the museum started out with a view that what was our story and how did it differ from other communities, and how was it unique, and how was it similar to every other story, even though that story is told in thousands of community museums across Western Canada. We wanted to have material in the museum that would stand out. And I think one of the earliest standout stories for the museum to consider was the fact that in those days, the Indigenous presence in museums was not very noticeable. Most museums were developed with the idea that they would tell the settler story, not the Indigenous story. And so from the very beginning, we tried hard to include the archaeological history and the story of the presence of the Indigenous people in our area. And we are in an interesting point in which the Red Deer River is the boundary between Treaty Number 6 and Treaty Number 7. And so although most of the people to the north were Cree and most of the people to the south were Blackfoot, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, we were an area in which activity was pretty common for the Indigenous people. And the other really sort of signal difference for our community was that the homesteading system that developed out of the survey system of our country and was encouraging settlement. We had the Saskatchewan Land and Homestead Company came to this area and bought up large tracts of land in the area so that the land was either owned by the CPR, the Hudson Bay Company, or the Saskatchewan Land and Homestead Company. And when you wanted to come to Red Deer area to settle, you had to have money to buy the land back from the Saskatchewan Land and Homestead Company. You didn't just pay $10 and get a quarter section from the government. And so that meant that there was a different kind of earliest settlement in Red Deer. People had to have money and they had to have purpose. They were not just simply a refugee from Poland or a refugee from Ireland or somebody from the Highlands of Scotland. They were people who had an education very often. They had background, they had money, and they had a lot of energy to put into developing a new community. And so that made Red Deer slightly different, and that has continued right through until today, because Red Deer continually, through history, bats above its weight in comparison to other communities. During the wars, for example, in both the First and Second World Wars, the voluntary enlistment of soldiers from this area was highest in Canada. During the Second World War, the Milk for Britain's program, more milk was produced in the Red Deer area than any other place across Canada. And in Olympic sports, we have distinguished ourselves. In the Salt Lake City Olympics, for example, there were, I think, something like 40 Canadians involved in the Olympics, and 12 of them had roots in Red Deer. So that means that it was a pretty intentional community, and that we wanted to reflect in the museum.
Excellent. So I'd like to ask you a bit about the collection now, and you've hinted at this, but many museums that started in the late 1970s and early 1980s started with a collection that was largely telling the pioneer or the settler story. However, this museum in particular quickly transitioned to include a variety of stories. So can you tell us about some of the key moments in that transition as you grew the collection?
Right. Well, at the very beginning, naturally, the settler artifact poured in because people had been holding these in their attics and barns and basements for all those years, and there was no public place to leave them. And families were beginning to fragment, and people were beginning to live all over the world who grew up in Red Deer. And so there was a diminishing core of people to look after the history. And so the museum came along at a very important time. And so you had the usual flood of encyclopedias and sewing machines and irons and lanterns and plows and so on. And that all came in very quickly. And we had to make a decision that we were not going to include the large agricultural artifacts. Now, that decision was made early simply because we had only interior space, and we knew that we didn't have any exterior space available for the large artifacts, although we did make an exception and take a Red River cart and a tractor at one point, but that's part of the story. So ultimately, the people who were interested in the large agricultural artifacts ended up forming a secondary museum in Red Deer called Sunnybrook Farm. And Sunnybrook Farm has its own unique story, and it has been the repository for buildings and large agricultural artifacts and small artifacts related to the dense agricultural history of this area. And so even the tractor and the Red River cart are gone from this museum collection now. So there was a period in which the collection was rationalized and items were deaccessioned from this museum and taken to the Sunnybrook Museum, which is an outdoor park facility in the south part of our town that is very, very popular and highly visited. And so the collection began as a typical museum collection reflecting the type of people who came here to settle. And that's where we're struck with some of the elegant artifacts that arrived. You know, the sterling silver brush and comb sets that were included in dresser sets and in men's valet sets, and other exotic pieces that you would hardly expect would ever end up out here. The beautiful piano that the Bauer family brought with them, a rosewood piano that arrived here in 1884, and other really beautiful and, well, now very costly artifacts arrived with these earliest settlers. And the collection also reflected the interests of those of us who were on staff. And fortunately, we had a good start on a textile and costume collection, and that happened to be an interest of both the curator and myself as director. And it seemed that it would be a wonderful way to show the social history of our community. And so we endeavored to collect textiles and costume, and as a result, the museum has the fourth largest public collection of textiles and costume in Canada to this day. And it's a real challenge for the curators and the conservators to keep, because textiles are hard to manage. They're fugitive, and particularly some of the turn of the century silks, which had a lead salt that was put into them, rinsed into them, and that lead salt just disintegrates the silk over time. Doesn't matter what you do, it just disappears into thin air. And so that's been quite a challenge. But the textile collection grew hugely. The other collection, which was related to that was the domestic arts collection. And that was all of the things that are in a household that reflect the art and taste of the persons and the times. And so one of the distinct parts of the collection here, for example, is the linoleum collection. Now, linoleum isn't used very much anymore. We call it vinyl planking. But in the settlement period of Red Deer, linoleum was the floor covering of choice. If you had a covering on your floor, it usually was linoleum. And it came in strips and rugs and rolls, and sometimes it was wall to wall, but mostly in people's homes, it was a rug size, 9 by 12 or 7 by 5 or something like that. And it struck us that the sort of artistic expression at the time included the design of linoleum. And so we have I suspect, one of the largest linoleum sample collections in any museum, because we got room size pieces, but we also simply cut 2 by 4 foot sections out of linoleum in abandoned houses and so on, so that we could see the design. And so there's a whole raft of those. We have a large archaeological collection, because this was an area that was frequented by the Indigenous peoples, both the Blackfoot nations and the Cree nations, back and forth, and sometimes in struggle and sometimes in trade. And so there's a huge collections of points and scrapers and knives and so on that were artifacts picked up in the fields around Red Deer. Now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly where these artifacts were often picked up. We just don't know some of the archaeological history that could go with it, but we have a lot of it. And so the collection grew to also include a large military collection. Red Deer has a strong military history. I've already mentioned the voluntary enlistment, and so there was a number of people who served and a number of people whose uniforms have ended up in here as well. Not much military armaments, but a lot of military accoutrements are in the collection. So it was decided that one of the best ways that we could include the Indigenous people in the artifacts that we might be able to get our hands on, and a story that needed an opportunity for telling, was the period before the horse was introduced onto the plains. And so we did a Dog Days exhibit, and it was called Where the Old Man Slept. And it was a semi-permanent exhibition that we did, which means semi-permanent, meaning that the exhibit would last for 4 or 5 years in the main gallery and would be a feature of the museum. And when I said that was partly purposeful and partly happenstance, the happenstance was that we had a researcher come to work in the archives for a summer job, and we had an Indigenous person from Asiniw-waci come down, saw this man working at the table and said, "You are going to help me find my ancestors." And that ignited a whole research into the Indian Industrial School and its connection with the Indigenous people. And out of that came the fact that we were sensitized that when we did this exhibit, we used the Indigenous people through this gentleman. We used them as resource people for building our exhibit. But we also got the idea that the labels and text panels and so on for this exhibit would be done in English and French, which was pretty standard in museums if you received federal funding. But we also would do it with Cree syllabics. so that somebody who could read Cree syllabics could come in and enjoy the exhibit as well as somebody who read English and French. And it was with the great help of the elders at Asiniw-waci that they took our labels and our text panels and translated them into what they considered to be a good version in the Cree syllabics. And so that was the first exhibit in Canada that we know of that had Cree syllabics as well as French and English labels and text panels. So that was a major step forward for the museum. And was the first really inclusive piece where we could give a large part of an appropriate part of the permanent gallery, so that we didn't just tell the settler story, we didn't just tell the war stories, we told the story of that aspect. And that subsequently has been a theme throughout the development of the museum. And I'm pleased to say that after I left, that same sensitivity, which was being nurtured more publicly and more broadly in society, has continued to this present day. And you will learn that a series of dancing regalia was commissioned by this museum, put on exhibit, and became part of the collection. And it's not historic. It was purchased and commissioned for the collection. And then there is the single artifact that the museum does not hold in its collections, it holds on permanent loan from the Provincial Museum, is what looks to be a stone bowl about this big around and about that high. And it's actually a pestle, a mortar and pestle. We don't have the pestle, we have the mortar. And it's actually about an inch thick stone, and it was used to grind grain or whatever. And a young fellow brought it into the museum and said he'd found it in some fill dirt out by the sewage treatment plant, which means we have no idea where it originated because it was in disturbed ground. He brought it in and we admired it. It looked like it was black, but it's actually dark green crystalline material. It's very beautiful. I took it to Ottawa to the Canadian Conservation Institute and asked them if they could give us any information on it. And they got some starch grains out of the bottom of it and determined that it was 6,400 years old. And it is the oldest stone worked artifact in Alberta, as opposed to being a blade or a scraper or an arrowhead. This is an actual item of use. And so immediately that it was identified as to what it was felt that it had come through the Rocky Mountain passes in trade, because it's made of nephrite, which is a central British Columbia stone. And it would have come across the Kootenay Plains and out into the following the North Saskatchewan River and out to the Red Deer area, and it landed somewhere in Red Deer here and was excavated somewhere in Red Deer here, but we don't know just where. We suspect from somewhere in the downtown, but we don't know. And so the Provincial Museum said, that's an archaeological artifact. It's owned by the Crown, and we'll have that. And I said, but we want it here, arranged to have it on permanent loan. So it's another really important artifact from this area that really spurred the interest of the Indigenous people of this area and the people involved in the collection here in the area. So the milestone of developing the Cree syllabics in the exhibit, that was of singular importance. And the finale came when there was some huge amount of research done on the Indian Industrial School, and the First Nations people here have a spring feast every year, and they devoted a series of 4 spring feasts to recognizing the children who were lost in this particular school. The Red Deer School had the poorest health record of any of the 165 residential schools. And so research was done, and it was discovered where the cemetery was, and it was known that there were 4 graves in the Red Deer Cemetery here of children from that school. And so a society was formed called Remembering the Children Society. And with the Indigenous people of the area, we did the 4 series of reflections on the children. And the 3rd ceremony after the feast saw that 4 wooden grave markers from the graves at that school were brought to the museum collection, and one of them is on display here in the museum. And the 4 wooden markers were actually rescued by an adjacent landowner who saw these wooden markers in the grass and decided that eventually they were going to disintegrate to nothing. So he picked them up and put them in his garage, and he kept them for about 30 years in his garage. But he was quite happy to bring them to the museum and add them to the collection. Meanwhile, the 4 unmarked graves in the Red Deer Cemetery, we knew the names of those 4 adolescent people. They died in the 1918 flu epidemic 100 years ago. And so the Remembering the Children Society got busy and raised a large black monument that on one side has the names and dates of the 4 children, and on the other side has a story of the Red Deer Industrial School. So there has been a real flowering of the inclusion of the Indigenous people. And I might also add that while we're on that theme, an effort to include the immigrant people, because just in my lifetime, I remember the Hungarian refugees arriving, the Czechoslovakian refugees arriving. In the 20s, long before I was born, the people from the Hebrides arrived, and then we had the boat people from Vietnam, and so on. And all of this has been purposefully recorded into the museum so that those people should see themselves in the museum.
So in 1992, you co-hosted a national conference titled Turning the Page with Phil Fontaine, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Just a huge accomplishment. I'd love to hear about how that came to be and what came out of that important meeting.
Well, that's an interesting story. It's a story that I was involved in, but the museum was not central to. Calgary was celebrating the Olympics in 1988, and our sister museum, Glenbow in Calgary, decided that they would put on an exhibition that would particularly celebrate the Indigenous people. So they developed an exhibit called The Spirit Sings. Well, they did their best job, I understand, and they included a lot of Indigenous people in the development of the exhibit, but it was felt to have fallen short. And so the Indigenous people demonstrated against the exhibit. And of course, they had a world stage platform because this was the Olympics. So whenever The Spirit Sings was mentioned, the demonstrations against it was mentioned, and it was Calgary Olympics. So Calgary withstood that, but the exhibit then moved to Ottawa. Well, when it got to Ottawa, things are always very political in Ottawa. So there were huge demonstrations in Ottawa against this. And the land claims issue grew up, and one of the northern groups, the land claims, it hit the front pages, and it was a very serious time, and museums were being pilloried at the beginning, at the center of it. All the ills of colonization that we now talk about every day. Remember, this was 1988, 89. Though all of what we are talking about today, and rewriting history and decolonization and the Queen's funeral and all of that that's just happened now, where that's top of mind. This was being laid at the doorsteps of museums. And Glenbow was being pilloried, and museums generally were being pilloried. At that time, I was president of the Canadian Museums Association, and Phil Fontaine was the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. So we got together, the Assembly of First Nations, their membership, and the Canadian Museums Association, and we sponsored a conference in Ottawa called Turning the Page. And it was to examine how museums treat Indigenous people and their story and their artifacts. And out of that wonderful conference with 400 attendees came a set of protocols for museums to follow. In other words, Indigenous people would tell their own story in their own words. Thank you very much. We'll let you translate it into English, but it's our story. These are our artifacts, and we will control who sees them and who doesn't see them, and all of the spiritual pieces will be dealt with in a respectful and spiritual manner. And artifacts that don't belong to a museum will be returned to the communities. And so I'm giving you a Cole's notes of the protocols. It goes on and on and on. But that set of protocols was taken by the United Nations and used throughout the world as the basis for the protocols for museums throughout the world to use as the basis in which they would deal with Indigenous people's history and culture. And it has resulted in huge repatriation of artifacts, where artifacts that were collected in the early 19th and 20th century would be returned to where they belonged if they were wanted, and if there was a mind by the Indigenous community to have them back. And so for the last, since 91 was that conference. Since 91, the last 30 years, there has been huge repatriation, not only of artifacts, but also of the skeletal remains that were collected. Because at the turn of the century, there was a great question being asked, which was the superior race? White, black, red, or yellow? And so anthropologists went out and they measured the size of people's brain cavities and the size of their skull, the length of their leg bones and the width of their hip bones and all sorts of things, and then gathered all this stuff and put the skeletons in bankers' boxes in museums. And so you had museums in Europe and Britain and throughout the United States and Australia and New Zealand, and they all had these huge collections of artifacts that really were doing nothing to promote the museum and its understanding and learning, and yet had been taken, often stolen, from Indigenous communities. So there's been this huge repatriation of artifacts. In fact, it's an argument that we can use with the provincial government or provincial museum to keep the stone mortar here in Red Deer because it was found here and it belongs here. The Indigenous people brought it here and used it. And so that was, the title of the conference was called Turning the Page, and it really was a revolution in museum thinking. And there have been questions about artifacts and items in particularly the British museums, because Britain had a large empire and they brought things back from their empire, and they're in the British Museum. And even the crown jewels are often referred to as a collection of loot and booty from various imperial holdings. The most famous, of course, in the world are the Elgin marbles that were on the Parthenon in Athens, and they were peeled off the Parthenon remains and spirited away to the British Museum and remain there. And for some reason, Britain refuses to give them back to Greece, and Greece has never fussed all that much about it. But it is an example of early displacement of things that museums were holding that they might better have not.
So in 2012, you were given a Cree name, meaning mountain eagle. Firstly, could you pronounce it for the record? And secondly, could you tell us about the name and its importance?
Well, this was perhaps one of the great honors of my life, was to have opened a letter. I was mayor at the time, and I had been working with the elders of the community in seeing how we could work as a municipal government with the Indigenous people who lived in Red Deer and area. So I opened a letter one day, and it was an invitation from the elders asking if I would accept an honor naming, and that they proposed to do that at the spring feast in 2012. And it happened to be my birthday, and they didn't know that. So that struck me as a very interesting sign. So of course I naturally said yes. And at the spring feast, which is held at Fort Normandeau, one of the territories that I was in charge of as director of the museum and head of the nature center and so on, the ceremony would take place there. And so I was named Mountain Eagle. In Cree, that's Asiniw-waci Kihiew. And it was a name that was chosen for me by an elder at Masquachese. And the whole idea of the mountain eagle is that you fly higher and see further. And that was a huge compliment to me in my community leadership role. It's very humbling to receive that honor. And in that honor, at the ceremony, we did the usual spring feast ceremonies with Thanksgiving and pipe service and prayer. And this is an interesting personal story. There was a smudge lit in the center of the arbor. And there would have been about 2 or 300 people there. They were all sitting around a few deep, all in a big circle around on the lawn, the river in the background. And a little smudge was burning in the center, and the smoke was kind of moving toward the river. It was a very calm spring day in early June. And the smoke was wafting out over the green and into the direction of the river. And so it was announced that I should go to the center and stand facing the river by the smudge. And then Elder John Cryer from Masquachese came and he faced me. And I was also being adopted into an Indigenous family, Frank and Rosina Winnie, and they were invited up. And so the ceremony began, and I was adopted by the family. It was announced that I'd been adopted by the family, and that this was a naming ceremony. And behind me, a fellow came up with an absolutely beautiful headdress, war bonnet. And when I was given the name Mountain Eagle, he put the headdress on my head with the ribbons and so on hanging down. And I had asked my son if he would come and photograph some of this. And I expected he'd take half a dozen photographs and that would be that. But he also had a camera that would take 10 frames a minute. 10 frames a minute? No, I don't know. Anyway, it took rapid fire shots. And when he showed me the pictures that he had taken, and what was absolutely mystical is that when the fellow put the headdress on my head, the smoke from the smudge between us ceased going to the river, and it swirled all around me and up towards my head. And he has this recorded on the film, and was quite startling to me. But it was a huge honor, and to be regarded as an elder, an honorary elder or an elder in the Indigenous community of Red Deer, and to be treated as an elder is really quite very special. It's an honor I hold very close to my heart, and I have tried since that time to continue to provide assistance and leadership and interpretation for the Indigenous community.
So I want to ask again, to get it on record because it's such a beautiful story, if you could tell us about the Métis sash that's in the collection.
Sure. The Métis sash was gifted to the collection from the late Dr. Kathleen Swallow. Dr. Swallow was an interesting individual in that she was trained as a pediatrician in the 1930s and started her career in 1936 and was a pediatrician at the Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton. And as her last posting in her very interesting life, she came to Red Deer to live and be the medical director of Michener Center, which was the provincial center for developmentally delayed young people. And Dr. Swallow called me one day and said, throughout my life, I have put together a collection of Indian art. This was 35 years ago, so the term Indian was acceptable at that time. And she said, if you want the Indian art for the museum, you can have it. And I said, we'd be honored to have it. So long story short, she gifted us 153 pieces of artworks done by Indigenous people, either Inuit or First Nations, that she had collected over her long life. And she had started the collection when she was working at the Charles Camsell Hospital, because the children would be brought down to the hospital with tuberculosis. They were being cured, and the parents were so appreciative that they would often bring a small carving, almost like an amulet, to her as a gift in appreciation. And she kept those as mementos of her patients and so on. And then she had an eye for art. And so she quickly began to realize that these were very special. And out of that, and other people recognizing the Inuit collection, Inuit talent, that the carvings and the prints and the silk screens and the stencils and the weaving all came together in what we now know as Inuit art. And it's a commodity in Canada now, but it wasn't in those days. So we got the 153 pieces, and amongst the things that she gave us and asked us if we wanted, she said, I have this Métis sash, but I only have half of it. And she said, if you want it, you can have it. And I thought, well, if she's only just going to throw it out, we might as well have it for the collection. It's a textile. And so she said, the reason there's only half of it is that I met a young doctor in medical school, and we saw one another and had plans that we would get married. But the war intervened, and he went off to war. And before he left, we cut the sash in half lengthwise, and he took half with him, and I kept the other half. And she said, he never came back. I never married. You'd have to see a movie of Kathleen Swallow to know how she took this, because for her, life was very cut, dried, and a matter of fact. He never came back. She had a fascinating career, and I know we're not here to talk about Kathleen Swallow, but I can't help but tell you, as context to that story of the Métis sash, she was invited to go to Johns Hopkins University and the hospital, and she was to be the head of a perinatal program to deal with pregnant women and immediately after their delivery. And she was very abrupt and very abrasive. She didn't brook any foolishness. And so she went down, and she was being given a tour of where her offices would be and the area that she would be in charge of. And at the end of the tour, she said, I noticed that if the person working at the desk is black, their telephone is black. And if they're white, their telephone is white. And everybody nodded. Yes, that was the way it was done there. And she said, well, if I'm going to work here, all the telephones will be beige. And that was, if this contract is going to go ahead, all the phones will be beige. And when she offered the collection of 153 pieces, she said to me, well, Sonny, do you want the collection or not? That was it. And I mean, everybody has stories like that about Kathleen Swallow, because it was no nonsense. Are you going to buy that or are you not? And she had a group of 7 collection which were sold. And she had a huge stamp collection which was sold, and the proceeds came to the museum. But that was just the way she did things. And I said to her, when you collected these pieces, did you collect them around any, like, was there anything that you were sort of looking for? She said, yes, the theme was maternity. She said, mother and child, adult and infant. She said that, and you will see that reflected in the Swallow collection. So there you have it.
Amazing. Really amazing.
And she always called me Sonny. I don't know where she got that. But she died tragically with Lou Gehrig's disease, and as a doctor, she treated herself. So she didn't treat herself at all. So she was in the hospital, and I went to see her very near the end of her life. And she had only just recently given up smoking to go into the hospital. And so I went into her room to see her one day, the last time I saw her. And I said, well, how are we today? And she said, Sonny, I'm not doing very well. You do the talking, I'll do the listening. That was the last I saw her. Okay.
Amazing. She sounds wonderful.
She was absolutely amazing.
Okay. So I would love to know, I've heard a bit from Kim that your wife was also helpful and was part of the museum family, and her wedding dress is here. So I'd love to know sort of her role and how she supported the institution as well.
Well, she did it from the back rooms because she already had enough public exposure as a teacher in the public system here and as an educator generally. So she did not need any particular exposure. She's a very wise woman, and she realized that she and I could do this job, and she was my partner throughout the whole thing. And as we were talking recently on a road trip, she said we poured more tea and served more squares because we always had events at the museum. Because when this building was built and opened in 1978, it predated much of Waskesiu Park, and it predated much of the other cultural amenities that occurred in the community. So this was the cultural hub. It was the center, and people had donated their artifacts. So this was their place. And so we had openings and gallery lectures and artists talking about their work and so on. And we, as Hazel said, we poured more tea and that sort of thing. And so she supported me so that I could work 20 hours a day doing the museum because she had various jobs with the public school system. She didn't work full time, but we had 2 young boys, and somebody had to hold the place together because this place in its early day really took a lot of time and energy. And at that time, not only was I director of the museum, that was my title, but I was also responsible for the Kerrywood Nature Centre, the Wildlife Sanctuary, Fort Normandeau, which is a park out on the river with another interpretive centre, and Heritage Park next door, Heritage Square, which is a small heritage facility, as well as the heritage signing system throughout Waskesiu Park. So it was a massive undertaking, and so Hazel was a well-known figure around here, and contributed much to the success of the museum.
I want to take us back to the beginning because I think there's some unpacking to do about all the various organizations that were tied into your role, how they fit together, and how they got sort of sorted out to be different institutions now.
Okay. Well, back to the beginning of the museum, when City Council determined that this museum would be built as a 60th anniversary project, the question was, how do we do that? Well, a museum society was formed, and there were a number of real stalwarts who joined the Museum Society. And actually, they were people who had been active in what we call the Old Timers Association. So you had people like Gertrude Richards and Stuart Mears and Agnes Richards and names of people who were at that time in their 70s and 80s who gathered together, and we began the museum. So the Museum Society developed its temporary museum in the basement of the Recreation Center next door, but plans were immediately underfoot for how we will get a museum building. Well, first of all, site. The city determined that this could be the site of the museum. It was on city-owned land next door to the Recreation Center, next door to the Golden Circle, and that was for the first setting. The second was choosing an architect and then developing the program for the architect to design this museum. So we used the federal government, and the Canadian Museums Association had developed a handbook of facility requirements and facility designs and so on that should be used in museums. So we got that, gave it to the architect, and the architect set about developing what the program would be. And construction began very, very soon because we had a very successful fundraising program. The Museum Society set about to raise roughly $1 million to build this building. completely furnished and ready to go, this building was just a little over $1 million. Now, that was in 1976, $77. And so the site was gifted by the city. The Chamber of Commerce had been holding lotteries in those days, and they'd built up quite a bank of lottery profits, but they didn't know what to do with them, because every time they suggested that they would give money to this agency in the city, somebody would complain that they weren't getting any money. And so they were a little bit flummoxed as to how they were going to get rid of this largesse. And finally, they decided that there were two places it could go. One, to the college for scholarships, because everybody supported that. And secondly, to the new museum project. So they started the campaign off with $100,000. And then Molly Bannister, who's a bit of a legend in the museum fundraising business, Molly Bannister, as a very elegant and urbane lady of the town who was active in everything, and Walter Code, who was the retired feed mill manager and owner. They decided to co-chair the campaign. Well, Walter knew all the farmers, and Molly knew all the local people here. And Molly knew that in her spike heels and pencil skirts that she was going to be no use at all talking to the farmers. Walter knew how to deal with them. And so they set about to raise money on a scale that had never been seen before. They raised about $210,000 directly from contributions from families. Many of the families are in the rural areas. They were rooted here and they had long histories here, and they were very active in their support, both in terms of dollars to build the museum and artifacts to supply it. And then the federal government had a program whereby they would contribute $500,000 to building a national exhibition center. And that's what this big gallery is about. It was part of the original building, and it was a big gallery that would accommodate traveling exhibitions. And this fit the national exhibition policy at the time, where the federal government wanted to get exhibits moving across the country, and you had to have a place to show them. So this was going to be the show place, and the federal government gave us $500,000 for this. So that was half the cost of the whole project. $100,000 from the Chamber of Commerce and $210,000 that was raised publicly, and then bits and pieces that were added on subsequently, and so on. So we built this building. John Murray was the architect, the local architect, did an amazing job of designing a building that's built on 16-foot square modules. So every room in this building is built as a multiple of 16 or a division of 16. And it's very interesting because, you know, the galleries are 48 by 32. That's what this gallery is. And everything was an imperial measure in those days. And so we built the building, and we moved into the building starting on April the 1st, 1978, from next door. So it was a matter of carrying the artifacts across. So we had an army of volunteers, and we didn't lose track of anything, and we placed things as well as we thought we could into the new building. And so we moved in April 1st, started in 1978. I had taken the job as director on January the 1st, 1978. On June the 1st, we opened to the public. Imagine, April, May, and June. April and May, we got ready. And so we put exhibits together of what we had and open to the public. The public were delighted to come. We had Ralph Steiner come to, no, just a minute. No, that's incorrect. Cut. We we opened to the public so that we would have the museum operating during the summer visiting hours. And then at the end of the summer, we closed to get ready for the official opening, which was held on October the 6th, 1978. And the exhibits that we put in here first for that opening was a borrowed exhibition on the work of Douglas Cardinal, the Métis architect from Red Deer. Métis, notice the tight connection. A sculptor from, a self-taught sculptor from Lethbridge, Bill Godlinton, who did Western bronzes. Can't remember the third exhibit. At that time. Anyway, we opened up. We had John Munro here, who came to represent the federal government, and Ralph Steiner came in June. He was the lieutenant governor, Honorable Ralph Steiner, an Indigenous lieutenant governor, came to open the building in June. So that was how we got started. Well, the museum was the darling of the community, and things were very rosy, and there was great interest in history and heritage, and there was this upwelling of enthusiasm. But it became very clear to me as director that we did not have an income stream that would keep this thing floating. And so we started eating into the surplus money that we had from the fundraising. And we saw that this was not going to last very long. So I spoke to the people at the city of Red Deer, and I said, what are we going to do here? And they said, well, we'll come up with an operating grant, and the Museum Society will continue to own the artifacts. And we need somebody to look after the new nature center and wildlife sanctuary that were being developed through Waskesiu Park development, the big linear park in our town. And they said, we'll put that all together and we will create a new management board. And they called the management board the Normandeau Cultural and Natural History Society. And it was to run the museum, the Nature Center, the Wildlife Sanctuary, Fort Normandeau Interpretive Center, Heritage Park, the signage program for Waskesiu Park. And that was great. And the city would provide an operating grant. And the city would also look after processing our payroll, which was a nightmare to us, and would put us on city benefits and so on. So we weren't city employees, but we had the benefit of working with the city as an adjunct. So the Normandeau Cultural and Natural History Society had representatives that were historically, their interest was primarily history, members whose interest was primarily natural history in the Nature Center and Wildlife Sanctuary, and people who were just interested in community affairs. And so it was a kind of a disparate board, but it worked very effectively. And it managed the museum. As director, I reported to them. And they would report annually to the city of Red Deer. Well, there was still some surplus money left over from the fundraising and the assembly of the capital program for the museum. So we developed what was called the Waskesiu Museum Foundation. And this was a foundation that would hold the money, and the revenue or the earnings from that would go towards special projects at the museum. And so the Waskesiu Museum Foundation had its own board, and it had about $100,000 to start with. And it has supported activities at the museum over the years. Shortly after we moved into this building, no, I shouldn't start that way. I should start this way. When the museum was being designed, it was noted that the Red Deer and District Archives Committee did not have a home. They were operating out of the unused elevator shaft of the public library. Well, when the public library decided to expand and wanted to put in an elevator, the archives had to move. And we said, well, couldn't they come and join us in the museum? So there was provision made for facilities for the archives in the museum. They chose that they didn't want to come at first. So for about, 8 or 10 months, they didn't move in, and then eventually they moved in. So we had the Museum Society owned the artifacts, the City of Red Deer provided the funding, the Kerrywood Nature Center society developed to look after the operation of the Nature Center from a nonprofit point of view. The Archives Committee joined in, and the Waskasu Museum Foundation was born. So all of these organizations had to work collectively and sympathetically together. And that was a challenge for me as director, because it was important that all of this worked to the greater good. Along came the Historical Society, and they decided that we needed to get a branch of the Alberta Historical Society in Red Deer, known as the Central Alberta Branch. So it developed out of the museum. And then finally, the Sunnybrook Farm Museum developed out of the museum to look after the larger artifacts that were related to agriculture. So we had a lot of agencies here. And after I left, I think there was a period of confusion, because one of the reasons that I was able to keep things moving amongst all of those agencies was that I had been present when they were all developed and how we each defined our area and what we were to do. The new people coming in didn't have that advantage, and so there was a bit of an upheaval, and they abolished the Normanville Cultural and Natural History Society, and the Museum Society reverted to operating the museum. The Kerrywood Nature Center retained its special group, but they developed a management board called the Waskasu Education Society. And so there was an evolution of management bodies, I guess you would say, over the years. But I must say that huge volunteer involvement, and that's something that was a hallmark of my memory in the museum. We had one man, John Rich, who came to he was a retired farmer. He came to the museum every day and volunteered fully every day at the museum for years and years and years, and was also a substantial donor to the museum. There's a story when they were raising money for the museum building. Somebody said, well, we should have a car raffle. You know, you can always make $10,000 off a car raffle. And Mr. Rich was a Presbyterian, and he did not think it was appropriate that the museum should have a raffle. So he said, I would prefer we didn't have a raffle on moral issues. And they said, oh, John, don't be such a stick in the mud. It's $10,000. It's easy, you know. And the next day, Mrs. Bannister came to her office to do some fundraising work. And in the bail of her typewriter, which is two terms that most people today won't understand, but in the typewriter was a check for $10,000 from Mr. Rich. And on the subject line, it said, I trust this will mean we don't have to have a car raffle. But it wasn't just 10,000, it was 10,001. So a while later, John came up with another check for $10,002. And so one day somebody said to him, John, what does this mean that one check is $10,001 and the next one is $10,002? And he said, oh, that's so I can keep track of them. He said, I've got them written up to 5. And so a donor and a volunteer every day. We had volunteers from the Museum Society, volunteers, well, obviously peopling all these boards and things were volunteers, but coming in to work every day at the museum. And one day I got a call from a social worker, and he said, I've got a client who's got MS and he has been unable to work, and we're wondering if he can come to the museum and work, because he said, you people have developed a building that's all on one floor. It's physically accessible. All your doors are wide and everything. And he's in a wheelchair. So I said, yes, bring him along. So I can remember vividly the day they announced that he was about to arrive, and he came to my office, and he was struggling in his wheelchair because he had some spasticity and he could not navigate on the carpet. And he was slumped in his wheelchair, and his speech was somewhat garbled. And I had an opportunity to interview him for a while. And I thought to myself, I'm wondering what useful thing he can do here. And I was having quite an internal struggle, thinking to myself, how are you going to get out of this one? So finally, a voice spoke to me and said, Godfrey, how be we do it this way? We'll try it for a month. You come every day and volunteer, and we'll see how it works for us, and we'll see how it works for you. He said, all right. So he came for the first month, and it was amazing because giving him a focus to get up and get out of bed in the morning, he'd been home 14 years unable to work. It turned out that he had been a parts person in an automobile dealership, so he knew numbers and location and keeping things straight, and of course that's what looking after the collection is all about. Godfrey moved in here, and he volunteered for us for 8 months. And then we got an employment program that he actually got paid to come. And that ran out, and he continued to volunteer. And he volunteered and worked at the museum on and off in a series of events for 17 years until he retired. And one day, I was whipping through the back, and Godfrey had taken apart an outboard motor, completely taken it apart, had all the pieces laid out on the table, had put a number on each of those pieces. He can't put the number on. He could get them ready, and somebody who had a steady hand could put the number on. And I was whipping off on my way to lunch, and I said, Godfrey, do you sometimes get a little lonely back here, working back here all the time with? He said, never. He said, after being home for 14 years alone, coming here and having 2 coffee breaks and noon hour with people is like living in Grand Central Station. And so he's a story of somebody who came here and, as I say, spent 17 years, I believe. He retired at 65. Another young woman was hearing impaired, but a very skilled researcher and writer. And she came, and in order to build resume, she worked with us for a long time. We had a little gift shop. It was run entirely by volunteers, a volunteer manager of the gift shop, and all the clerks were volunteer. They did a rotation and so on. All of the social events that we put on were all done by volunteers, my wife included, often being the first mate, but again, always using volunteers. And so at one point, it occurred to me that not only did we run on volunteers, but that we had 9 people volunteering who were actually disabled people. So I had the hearing impaired girl write up an article documenting this, and it was published in the National Museum Journal of the 9 people who contributed fully. And that was only 9 of hundreds of volunteers. We used to keep track. We used to figure that we had 2 full-time people if you patched all the volunteer time together, just with the people who came in every day to work at the museum, not all the people who ran the governance pieces and so on. So volunteering was absolutely critical. It extended the work that we were able to do by many, many, many times. People would come in and take people through the gallery, and the Christmas program was absolutely stupendous. We had a fellow who had a little slideshow that was called The Night Before Christmas. And he would show the slideshow to kindergarten kids. And a kindergarten class would come in, and some would go in and do the slideshow. Some would go into the gallery and do a gallery tour. Some would go into a little group and do a craft, a Christmas craft, making paper decorations. And then they would all come together at the big tree, the Christmas tree here, with the 14-foot Christmas tree with all the decorations on it. And then they could put on the decoration that they'd made, and they could take one home from the tree from the classes that had come earlier. And we used to run that program. Well, it was booked, by the end of September, it was booked fully for all the days before Christmas that the kindergartens operated. And I think we would put like 2 or 3 classes in the morning and 2 or 3 classes in the afternoon. So it was just a melee of kids. And to help with moving these kids around and so on, we had some people who were volunteers, and they were elves, and they were given a little sort of felt collar, a little felt hat with a bell on it, and little felt things to go around their ankles, and bells and rings around their wrists, and so that they were decorated up in red and green felt. And they were critical to managing these masses of kids going through, because I mean, they're little kids, and they're just, they're just boggled by this whole thing. And one day, frequently, some of our volunteers were volunteers who were people who had been assessed fines, and they could work off their fine by doing public service. These were fines option people. So one day, a fellow came in and announced that he was a fines option person, and he had so many hours that he had to do. And he was a shorter person, very wiry built, very active, and he was a young guy, about 25 or maybe a little older. And I said, well, come on in, and I'll talk to you for a bit, and we'll see what we can put you to doing. And what we really needed were elves. And so this fellow came in, and I chatted with him. And so I said, well, what do you do for a living? And he said, well, I'm a cowboy and a bull rider. And I thought, how are we going to work that into the whole thing? So I said to him, well, I tell you what, our greatest need right now before Christmas is with our kindergarten programs, and we need people to guide the kids and help the kids with the crafts and so on. And we call these people elves, and they get to wear the little outfit. Come and I'll show you. So I showed him the people who were working as elves at the time. And he said, well, that sounds fine. I said, well, I hope it isn't demeaning to you or in any way offensive to you, but I said, that's what we need. He said, suits me. So he came in and he elfed for that whole Christmas. And I can remember seeing him only 5 or 6 years ago. He's a man now 50 years old. And he does remember being an elf at the museum as a volunteer. We had another fellow volunteering at the museum. He'd grown up in Michener Center, but in their normalization program, he had moved out. He had an apartment that he shared with another fellow, and the two of them lived with some supervision. And David came every day to work for, well, I was here for 20 years, and he didn't retire for another 15 until after. So he would have been here for more than 30 years, every day as a volunteer, and very capable, very helpful, did all sorts of things that would help Diana, who was the person looking after the exhibits. So, volunteering was huge, and it amounted to having 2 extra people equivalent every month.
Okay, I have a tough question for you. I'd love to know, in your 20 years at the museum, what was the biggest challenge you faced?
I think the biggest challenge was always trying to hit the mark of relevancy. because if we weren't relevant, we weren't going to last. If we weren't relevant and providing the service that the city was buying for tourism and education and community history and social and cultural advantage, then we weren't going to get the money. If we weren't relevant to the public coming to see the museum and visit the museum and learn what was going on at the museum, we wouldn't last. Because if numbers weren't up, that was an indication to the city that this was irrelevant. If we put on an exhibit and nobody came, that meant that we were playing a game that other people didn't. So we had to be relevant. And if you were looking for public support in funding and gifting and artifacts, you had to be relevant. And right behind relevant would be authentic. It had to be true. And we had a rule in the museum, and I was so confident with all my people working here as volunteers and as staff. You couldn't tell who was being paid and who wasn't. That was the mark of perfection for me, because people didn't know. But somebody coming in wouldn't know whether you were a staff member, a volunteer, and it really didn't matter because you were treated the same. You just didn't get a check on Friday. But you had to be authentic. And one of those ways was if you asked us a question and we didn't know the answer, we never said, I don't know. The answer always was, I can't tell you right now, but I will find out. And you followed that through. And so you were accurate, fulsome, and on the ball. And that meant that when we put up an exhibit and put a label on it, that the label was right. And if it was wrong, it got changed. I mean, if somebody could come in and say, no, you've got that backwards, or that's the inside and you're looking at the outside. Or if we took the lines for our Indigenous exhibit to the people at Asiniw-waci and asked them to put it into Cree syllabics, if it was wrong, they weren't going to translate it into Cree. So, I mean, authenticity, relevance first, because it was lifeblood. Authenticity was how you kept going. And the third one, well, it wasn't the third one, it's another part of authenticity, is if I'm going to give you a revered family artifact, I want to know it's going to be maintained, looked after, exhibited, studied, and made available to the public. And with the advent of digitization, museum access has been revolutionized. Because whenever you go into a museum, there's 50 times more stuff in the back room that's waiting to come out in the next exhibit, or may never get out onto display, maybe in such poor condition you can't put it out, but it's being saved, it's being preserved. And so all of that stuff is now digitized and all of it is available. You can go onto the museum websites and you can punch in a particular request and up will come the picture and up will come all the research that's been done about it. And if that isn't happening in a museum isn't happening. It's just an expectation. Because people, although we can travel easily today, we haven't got time to get to everywhere we want to see what there is. And so if we have something here that's very special, if Glenbow is putting together an exhibit, well, here's an example. Part of Lethbridge story is that there was a prisoner of war camp in Lethbridge during the Second World War. And when Lethbridge was doing its story as in the museum, the story of the community, it had to deal with the prisoner of war camp. But they didn't have any artifacts. We We have the only Canadian prisoner of war uniform in Canada in this collection of textiles. And so they borrowed our jacket, hat, and pants and made replicas to use in their exhibit. They admit they're replicas, but they admit that the original is held by the Red Deer District Museum here. So that's yeah.
Excellent. One collection we haven't touched on yet is the art collection. So I'd love to know sort of firstly why you think an art collection is important for telling the history of Red Deer and how it came to be such a huge part of this institution.
The art collection actually had its genesis in my day, but it had its flowering after my period here. I mentioned early on in our discussions that we had an appreciation for domestic arts. And of course, domestic arts and fine arts and crafts and so on are all part of the same family. It's just the degree of sophistication. The college developed a permanent collection early on as their 20th anniversary project, and they have a very large and very impressive fine art collection at Red Deer College. And it's international, it's contemporary, it's historical, and it has some local reflections. The art for the museum here grew out of the art that people had in their homes. And they'd say, well, aren't you going to take these paintings? Aren't you going to take, grandma's China painting that she did as a girl? And so, yes, we took all of that. And then we realized that it was unlikely that Red Deer is going to develop an art gallery separate from the museum. These are very expensive organizations to operate. And so the decision was made that we would take art. It's fairly easy to look after if it's two-dimensional art. A little bit trickier if it's sculptural pieces. Ceramics can get broken. And textiles, we are very familiar with all of the art that comes with textiles. So a decision was taken a few years ago that they would actively build an art collection. And so knowing that, some of the local art people have actually vested their collections into the museum. And one most notable one is David Moore. David Moore was born in Scotland, but he grew up in Red Deer. He's a faculty member from Red Deer College Art and Design Department. Does beautiful work. His work is very popular. There were pieces in the collection. And when David decided to clear his studio of materials that he'd retained, pieces that he'd recovered after they'd gone to other owners and so on, he left his entire studio collection to Red Deer College. And I understand that Jim Westergaard has done the same thing. He's a retired Red Deer College faculty person, and he, in his finale and wrap up on his art life, he's gifting his collection. And he is an engraver, just beautiful engraving work that he's done. So the art collection grew sort of necessity because people had collected art and wanted to continue. And then, of course, the Swallow collection was gifted to us, and it's all Indigenous art, and it's either fine craft or fine art. So it became a logical step.
Excellent. So we talked a lot about the connections with Indigenous communities during your time at the museum. And then you spoke about that there were so many other groups here, specifically immigrant groups. Is there a particular group or collaboration that stands out to you as particularly important that we haven't talked about yet?
Actually, the collection of immigrant pieces, I would say, immigrant pieces from the second half of the 20th century, from 1950 to onward, that much of that occurred, much of the enlightenment for that occurred in my latter years. And so while we got into it with the textiles initially, the actual collecting of the stories more than artifacts has been the work of the museum. And they've done some sterling work in collecting the stories of immigrants. But there was always the nod to the early Chinese community. We had a very large and engaged Chinese community in Red Deer from very earliest times. And institutions like the Club Cafe, which were a stopping house between Calgary and Edmonton for people on the highway. Gates Avenue at one time was the highway between Calgary and Edmonton, and the Club Cafe was the stopping point. And that was a large Chinese community. And then ethnic communities developed in the rural areas, like the Danish community out at Dixon, which has developed its own Danish-Canadian museum and archives and center, and the Icelandic community at Markerville, and they've developed an interpretive center, and they have the cemetery and the tour and everything out there. And then the British people populated the area to the east of Red Deer. The Scandinavian people continued into the Sylvan Lake area, so that you've got Swedes and Norwegians, and one of the post-war immigration stories that the museum focused on was the Estonians. We had a very prominent Estonian leader in the community. Her name was Rita Matthiessen, and she was instrumental. Well, she arrived after the war with her husband from Estonia, and interestingly, at that time, although her husband was a noted boreal forest specialist and she was a dentist, they were asked to sign papers that they would not pursue their career, but rather that they would be farmers, because Canada was wanting farmers, lumbermen, and longshoremen. And you had to fit those categories if you wanted to emigrate from Europe. So although Dr. Matthiessen was a dentist, she never practiced here. She was a farm wife. And Dr. Matthiessen, the husband, never practiced boreal forestry, although Canada has the largest boreal forest in the world. That contradiction always boggled my mind. But, of course, the Mathiessens got very busy in community leadership. And Rita Matthiessen was involved in developing the Alberta Home and School Associations and Alberta's public library systems. And so she was retired and living in Red Deer and volunteering at the museum. And she said, the Estonian society now finds that we're into the second and third generation, and it's going to wind up its affairs, but it's got some money. And she said, it's been suggested that we use that money to get Estonian traditional costumes made, and that we donate those to the museum. So for a while, we had an exhibit here of a man, a woman, and a teenage girl, and they were outfitted in authentic Estonian traditional costumes made by Estonians in Toronto, using Estonian coins and so on as part of the decoration. And they gave us the flag that came on the last Estonian ship that fled from Estonia to Sweden. And there was a sort of a hope chest and a couple of other things, and we made a small exhibit out of this, but the mannequins with the clothing on were absolutely beautiful. And interestingly enough, the significant Estonian flag was stolen from the exhibit. We don't have many things that were stolen from the museum, but that was one of them that was made. And I can remember we were having the official opening of this little exhibition, and the flag had been stolen. And I went to Calgary and I went to the flag store and I bought the fabric for the black, white, and green, or black, white, and blue of the Estonian flag, and came home and made the flag and put it up. It wasn't the authentic piece, but it was an Estonian flag, because where would you buy an Estonian flag? Anyway, that was one of the groups that came early, and but of the more lateral groups, the Czechoslovakians and the Hungarians and the Vietnamese, I know there are things in the collection, but that all happened after my period.
Because a lot of what you've been talking about is very like active collecting, not waiting for people to bring you things, but going out to find those stories, and sort of your thoughts on how you prioritized the collections during your time.
Well, when you're collecting, you keep in the back of your mind all of the things that you already have. And so you have streams in which your collection is strong and streams in which your collection is weak. We don't need any more arrowheads, scrapers, and stone knives. So there isn't a search for these things. But when something like the mortar came along, we were right on top of that. And so you encourage that to come to the museum, because the person who had we call it the stone bowl, but the person who had the mortar didn't know what it was, had no idea of the significance. We had some idea of the significance, but no idea that it was going to be the oldest known worked stone artifact in Alberta. So that becomes, we weren't actively collecting artifacts, that just came to us. On the other hand, we have been actively collecting textiles the whole time. I mean, if somebody said to me, we've got this, and this, and I might say, well, we're particularly interested in the textile pieces. We're not so interested in this, that, and the other. And they say, well, you either take it all or you don't take any. That was one thing. And so you build on your strengths, but you don't just build your strengths, you also try and fill the holes that you have here, where you may have a local artist and we have no representation. And so you let it be known into the community, because the community is your arms and legs. And they'll say, oh, there's one of those down in the pawn shop. Maybe we should buy that and put it in the museum. I was out in one of the surrounding towns not very long ago this summer, and I saw a beautiful print by a noted woman Indigenous artist in Alberta. And I thought, well, that's a wonderful price on that print. So I mentioned it to the people at the museum here, and I said, I can get that for you and I'll gift it to you if you'll have it. I don't want to buy it and then have you refuse to take it. So they said, oh no, we'd love to have it. So I bought it and brought it in, and they all fell over in joy that it was here. But so you actively collect. Now, we didn't have anything by her in the Swallow collection of Indigenous art. So that was, you actually went out and purchased the piece. Normally, we don't buy artifacts. We don't buy any artifacts. I bought it, but I gave it to the museum, my wife and I. So if there are things that we really don't want in the collection or we can't use, but somebody is foisting it on us, we put it in what's called the study collection, and that means it's not in the permanent collection. If it goes in the permanent collection, it stays. and it's looked after, unless for some reason, exceptional reason, it gets deaccessioned. On the other hand, the study collection can be used and handled and sent out to schools and taken to a display at the mall or something like that. And so collecting is, it's intentional, but in a community museum like this, it's all gifted. And we can issue tax receipts for the gifts. And we have the two collections, the study collection and the permanent collection. And that the collection is closely guarded by the museum, it's governed by the Museum Society. If, for example, if you've got a ceramic piece in the permanent collection and it inadvertently gets damaged and it's no longer intact, well, you're going to deaccession it. But that has to go with a report to the collections committee, and the collections committee make a recommendation to the Museum Society Board, and it's officially deaccessioned. Like, you can't just shovel up the pieces and send it out the back door and say, geez, I don't know what happened to that. And so it's like an accounting system. Everything has to be accounted for. And so people know that if they brought in, my wife gifted the cowboy boots that she wore in the Calgary Stampede when she was 3 years old. They're in here. And if they weren't in here and she wanted to see them, she would want to know why. Anyway.
Amazing. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap up, so I have a big question for you. You've worked or volunteered at the beginning when it was being fundraised for the museum for nearly 2 decades, and you remain passionate about the institution after you finished your tenure here. So I'd love to know what draws you to this place and has kept you connected to it.
I suppose what draws me to this place is the same thing that draws me to the other endeavors in the community. And that is that as a teacher, my first inclination is to teach and help people learn. And secondly, I am passionate about our community having the resources that it needs to be fulsome, particularly in the area of culture. Area of sport has not got my attention anywhere near as much as areas of culture and language and learning. And so, it's not a surprise that I've been involved in the Red Deer College, and particularly the Red Deer College Art Collection, and the Ellis Bird Farm, and the Medicine River Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and the Historical Society, and the Cultural History Society, and the Symphony Orchestra, and on all of that. That is all the stuff that I have devoted my entire life to, as a volunteer, and in this case as part of my vocation. But the museum holds that connection with history, and the living part of that is what absolutely fascinates me. More than anything. And I realize that I get all carried away with the significance of something, and really, in the greater scheme of things, many people don't really care. but I found I did, and I would always be salvaging bits and pieces. And at my age, I looked back through my own personal stuff, and I look at ticket stubs from presentations that I went to when I was, well, they're 60 and 70 years old, and picture albums and snapshots of holidays that I went on, and things that I treasured, and ribbons that I won, and gifts that I was given, and Christmas cards that I was given. Look at all of that stuff, and of significance to me. It's of minor significance to my family. It's of likely no interest to anybody else, and it will fall into dumpster junk. But I find those touchstones to be important to me. And so I'm drawn back to. I was down here last night listening to a lecture by Frances Wright from Calgary, talking about the famous 5 women who were involved in the Persons case. And so I was here until 9 o'clock last night, and at 9 o'clock this morning, I'm down here doing this. It's just part of it, part of the. It's more than an interest; it's a passion. Yeah.
Before we stop today, is there anything else you want to add to this record that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet?
I think we've just about pushed all the boundaries. I think that we haven't talked about staff. And I suppose the one thing I would like to say about the staff is that the staff had to be special in that they worked shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, and that the staff were here long periods of time. Diana Anderson was our exhibits point person, and I'm sure Diana worked here for 30 years. In fact, I think her whole working career was here. Valerie Miller was our collections manager in later years when we got that specialized. There were only 3 of us here to begin with. That's another thing I should mention. When I came here, I was the director. I had another person who was a general assistant, and we had a person who was a collections person, did all sorts of programs and collections and everything. And then we had part-time people to supervise the galleries when they were open. So there, and a caretaker. So there were 4 core people operated this museum for several years. Mind you, with the help of volunteers and the help of summer staff and employment grant people and so on. So that was all how we managed to populate the museum in the early days with volunteers and temporary staff in employment programs and fine options people and so on. But Diana spent about 30 years here. Valerie she would be here at least 25 years. John Rich volunteered here for 30, well, maybe not 30 or 25 years. Godfrey volunteered for 17 years or worked here for 17 years. Michael Daw, who was in the archives, not directly involved in us, but Michael Daw was here for 25 years. So these were all long-term people. So it wasn't I spent a year at the museum and I didn't really get to know anything, but I did a year at the museum. These were all people who were really dedicated and really took their work seriously and reached out into the community. Like Diana had a stable of artists and creative people that she could draw on in a minute's notice. Doris Northey, who was the very first museum employee that we had, she was plugged into the Women's Institutes. And if you know anything about the Women's Institutes, they were the movers and shakers in the early days of libraries and women's affairs and family planning and home and school and all of that. And she was plugged into all of that. And they were plugged into the museum. And so you had a really hard core of museum dedicated staff. I mean, when as director, if I asked Diana to go the extra mile here or Valerie to go the extra mile or Rodney to do this, it was never I want the weekend off or I want this. We just did it. And, I was off a really interesting story. I hadn't thought about this for a long time. One day, when the building was built, the front entrance was recessed into an area 32 feet of recess into the building. So you come in the front door here, but there was building going out like this on around you. And there was a pool and some fountains and some mirrors out there. And it did not really work in this climate. And within 2 or 3 years, we replaced it with what's now the entrance that you come into. And it was an atrium. We had skylights and plants and fish and so on. And in the early days, the garden was a mess out the front. It was always blue papers and things, and the water was never clean. And so anyway, in the fall, I was out planting some tulips because I thought, well, we'll make this look lovely in the spring when the tulips are. So I bought a whole bunch of tulips, and I'm out planting tulips one Saturday morning. And this rather elegant couple arrived about 10 o'clock in the morning, and they introduced themselves, and they said, is the museum open today? And I said, well, no, it's not. Not until 1 o'clock, or I think. Maybe it wasn't even open on Saturday. I don't know. But they said, well, they were here from Hamilton, Ontario, and that she had grown up in the area, and her father had been the police chief, and they were back for a visit. And they were so hoping they would get to see the museum. But if the museum wasn't open, well, that would be the problem. So I'm down on my knees digging out, putting in the tulip bulbs. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I can let you into the museum. I looked at them and I thought, they're not going to bother anything in the museum. I said, I can let you into the museum. You'll be alone in there. But I'll be out here planting the tulips. And when you're finished, we can lock up again. And they said, oh, really? And so I let them in, and they spent about an hour and a half looking around and enjoyed themselves, and they came out. They a few years later, they retired to Red Deer, back to her hometown. And I discovered that he was the vice president of Stelco for Canada and had just retired. And they came, and they brought energy and enthusiasm and appreciation to the museum, but they always told the story of when the gardener let them in to see the show. and Mrs. McDermott was a very, very fashionable dresser. And when she left Red Deer, she left behind a wonderful selection of items from her wardrobe that are really, really key pieces in our collection of textiles, because she knew we collected textiles. So that was just a story about how we muddled together in the early days. And so it didn't really matter who you were; it mattered what you could do and how you could do it. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah.